Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse.
Hey guys, I'm back. After taking a few weeks off to focus on my work, I'm excited today to be joined by Jon Hartley. Jon Hartley is an economist specialized in finance, labor economics, and microeconomics. He's a policy fellow at the Hoover Institutions, and he is affiliated to a whole lot of wonderful places like Civitas Institute and the Mercatus Center and many others. He's also the host of the wonderful, really truly wonderful podcast, Capitalism and Freedom in the 21st Century. It's an official podcast of the Hoover Institutions. He's a member of the Canadian Group of Economists and founding chair of the Economic Club of Miami. He was at Goldman Sachs before, and I could go on and on and on and on. Jon is wonderful. I'm so excited to have you, my friend, to talk today, among other things, about the battle that you're fighting today with union and unionization at Stanford University, where you're finishing your PhD. So welcome, Jon.
Thanks so much, Vero, for having me. It's an honor.
It's my pleasure, really. I'm excited to be talking to you. I love talking to you on any topics, anytime. But today I want to talk to you about the battle that you're fighting with the Stanford unions. So in order to set the context for this, will be coming out next week, and we're recording on the 29th of August. And tomorrow you have a piece in the Wall Street Journal coming out on this battle that you're waging. And I learned about it because you had written previously a piece with a guy named Dylan Rem, I don't know how to pronounce it, in the Stanford Review. And it's called Stanford Graduate Workers Union Attempt to Fire Student Who Refuse to Join Unions. So please, can you tell us a little bit about what this battle is about?
Sure. So just some historical context. In recent years, unionization of graduate students has been on the rise at a number of schools, number of institutions in the U.S. And I would argue that these attempts at unionization, many of which have been successful in terms of forming a union and unionizing graduate workers, have been sort of done in I'd say, this kind of new woke progressive era. These sorts of unions are, I would say, quite different from, in terms of their sort of stated beliefs, of the unions of, say, the 1950s. And it's not just necessarily about trying to improve working conditions or trying to improve pay, but instead it's, I'd say, much more ideological in part. And there's a number of political positions that they put on every single issue under the sun that they have on their websites. This differs from varying degrees, but the vast majority of these unions, these student unions, which are affiliated with national unions. So, for example, at Stanford, the Stanford Graduate Workers Union is a local affiliate of the United Electrical Workers Union, as is the University of Chicago Graduate Student Union. They basically affiliate when they're formed with these national unions, and then they try and enter collective bargaining agreements with the universities. And how do they do that? They do that through sort of threatening strikes and so forth. And so that's been ongoing in the past few years.
This is what's happened in Stanford, right?
Yeah. So this has happened at Stanford, and there have been a number of other schools where this has happened. And there's been many unions formed at essentially graduate students who consider themselves to be workers and they're employees of the university. So typically graduate students, so PhD students, like myself have to work as teaching assistants and research assistants. And so there's some debate about, are graduate students workers or not? And is this more like an internship or work study thing? Does that really sort of fall under traditional labor laws? Students, a lot of graduate students aren't necessarily working that many hours. To be honest, typically, they'd be working effectively part-time hours or less, not necessarily full-time hours. And in my opinion, it's quite amazing. Some people are surprised to hear that graduate students are actually paid rather than students actually paying to attend the university and be part of the university. So,
is it actually the case? So, I've always heard, because I didn't study here in the U.S., that basically you shouldn't go and do a PhD in economics if the university is not actually taking you on for free and even giving you a stipend, because it means effectively they're signaling that you're just not going to cut it.
Well, I think that it depends. There's some schools that just have larger endowments and have greater capacity to fund students than others. There are some places where students are happy to, take the classes, not get funded by the school, not be paid by the school, but keep working outside the department and maybe earn some money doing a job outside the university. So, for example, I think George Mason University is a great example of this. I think there's many George Mason PhD students, economics PhD students, who have jobs, say in Washington, D.C. somewhere, while they complete their economics PhD. So, I'd say a lot of this depends on funding. The top ranked programs in general tend to be very well funded, and so students can earn money, but unless they are on something like an NSF grant or some other, say, university grant or prize that they've won, they have to do some sort of teaching or research assistance as part of their program to receive their funding.
From the list of schools where grad students have unionized, it seems that they're pretty elite schools.
I think so. I think there's a lot of non-elite schools that have also, if not unionized previously, maybe unionizing now. I mean, I think there's probably some bias at elite schools. It's easier for them to get into the news. So there's probably some selection bias in there. But my guess is that there's been a recent unionization wave in general. And this isn't just specific to graduate students attempting to unionize, but in recent years there's been sort of this new movement to unionize. Think Starbucks workers trying to unionize and so forth. So, and this is part of that. I think there's in that sort of era where people perceive there to be inequality in incomes, and this to be sort of an unfair thing, or that capital and owners aren't sharing enough of the gains with their workers, that there should be some more bargaining to make things more fair for the workers. I think in their minds, and I think that's what's driving part of this. I think what makes maybe the universities a little bit different is that universities are hotbeds of activism, and this is not news to I think anyone. But when what's also interesting is graduate students aren't necessarily full-time workers, and in my case, for example, I was accepted and agreed to enter Stanford in 2021, and at that time there was no graduate student union, and it's been formed since. So,
2023 is when they were doing the strike or threatening to strike, and then it was adopted in 24.
I think it was, yeah. So
yeah,
essentially what happened, so fast forward, so first, a union's created, graduate student union is created. And then what happened last year is, that they tried to get a collective bargaining agreement. Some of the things that they fight for, some of these unions, I'd say are somewhat reasonable. They're trying to get child care and so forth. For students, there's many graduate students who have very young children, and I think some of these concerns are perhaps more in that like classic wheelhouse, of trying to fight for economic fairness in wages and so forth that they perceive. So,
and this is maybe a little bit off topic, but it is true that, for instance, in economics, there is an issue with women, right? Because you do all, so you have to be an undergrad, and then often you will work a little bit, and then you go get a PhD, which takes many years. So by the time you're out and be able to actually like start maybe getting married or have children, you're already in your 30s. So it actually makes sense. I can see why in people, grad students would actually start having children before they're done, and then childcare becomes an issue, considering that while you're paid, which is actually quite amazing, that a grad program would pay you for an education and all of this. That I can see why having childcare paid would be, something that they would want.
Absolutely. So, I think there's. I'm not in any way trying to argue against, the right to organize. I think, there's, I think that's an important right. And I think, collective bargaining can be a useful tool to promote fairness and to get workers what things that they want, and in exchange for their labor and their services. But I think where things tend to hit where the rubber kind of meets the road is to what degree can unions coerce other people to join. And this is sort of the classic area of right to work, and many states in the past decade and a half or so have adopted so-called right to work laws that prevent unions from coercing others from joining the union. So, for example,
how many states, how many rights to work states do we have now? 27?
I think so. I think it's roughly half. It's largely Republican states. And I think, it's 27 states or so, and largely, again, Republican states. But in the case of Stanford, for example, the Stanford Graduate Workers Union last year threatened a strike, and they asked, in exchange for ending the strike or the threat of a strike, they got the university to sign a collective bargaining agreement. And one of the conditions in that collective bargaining agreement said that all graduate students who do not pay either dues to the union or agency fees to the union, their condition of that this would be a condition of employment, that paying union dues and agencies would be a condition of employment at the university for graduate students. So
the agency fees, is this what you would pay the union if you didn't want to join, but you still had to pay something?
Exactly.
Is that what it is? And they're roughly the same as the union fees?
Slightly less. So there's this comes out of a Supreme Court case, a 1988 Supreme Court case called Communication Workers of America versus Beck, and essentially it created something called Beck rights and allows people to be what we call a Beck objector. And a Beck objector can basically opt out of signing a union card, can opt out of joining a union. However, they still have to pay what are known as agency fees. Now, where these agency fees go, can be a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
Whether they go to the union or whether they go to maybe a charity can I think kind of differ. Obviously, the union wants the money, so typically, a union will try and make the agency shares payable to them, or they won't make it clear that there's enough.
Let's talk about what happened. What happened in June of this year?
Sure.
Right. So there's a collective bargaining agreement that
went into force earlier that year. Yes.
Yeah, and then in June, you guys received an email. So can you tell us about that?
In the months leading up to the in the months leading up to this, what happened is a number of graduate students who are part of the union, work as part of the graduate union. They obtained the numbers and emails of all the graduate students. They're able to do this through various labor laws that exist. And they began texting graduate students like myself and others, or emailing, or both, is my case. And they sent many emails basically saying, you must pay dues or agency fees, and otherwise your employment with the university is subject to termination. You will be terminated from the university. So threatening termination to students. And then finally in June, and they had several deadlines and so forth, and they kept moving the deadlines back. And then come June, they decided to then send termination requests to the university, essentially saying that this person is not in compliance and has not paid union dues or agency fees, and we are requesting their termination from the university. So it happened back in
That's
June.
Crazy.
Yes, and it went. This essentially goes to the labor relations group at the university, which is staffed by lawyers, university lawyers, and so a lot of these emails are in part legal in nature, or feel very legally crafted. So the university, they sort of, their response was, we confirm, receipt, and at first they kind of said, well, this is new to us. We haven't had a collective bargaining agreement before that has union membership or agency fees and union dues as being part of a condition of employment. We're going to have to review this and think about this. So that happened in June. It was kind of, at least in my mind, somewhat unclear what was going to happen. And it could be the case that maybe this school would choose to do nothing and just sit on it, and not enforce this, and not try to fire students who had not paid agency fees or union dues.
So let me ask you this. So does it mean the university hadn't read the bargaining agreement it agreed to? Because if it wasn't there, right? I mean, they must have known that this was a possibility. And didn't they think that the unions would actually be serious about it? And the second question, I guess, would be, how enforceable is it? What's the weight legally of that agreement?
So the challenge is, because California is not a right to work state, there actually is legal enforceability here. So there's a lot that because of this collective bargaining agreement was signed, and ultimately I think it was clearly a mistake on the part of the university to agree to this, and maybe they didn't realize or foresee how this would play out, or maybe they didn't think that the union would try to enforce this or try to have students fired or terminated. It's something that the union decided that they wanted to go forward with, and in fairness, there are other schools where this has occurred, at Cornell, MIT, University of Chicago. So there are similar collective bargaining agreements that schools agreed to, and perhaps foolishly, but they agreed to it nonetheless. And then the unions, went forward, and they went forward with attempting to terminate students. And so what happens is, because the university signed the collective bargaining agreement, if they don't comply with some of these demands from the university, it's possible that that the union can then go to various groups out there, that basically NLRB and other sort of entities that sort of enforce labor relations in the United States, and they can say, hey, you're not living up to the collective bargaining agreement, and we're going to challenge you, and we're going to have you reprimanded by sort of the labor authorities, if you will. So
it's kind of interesting that, the unions kind of like to present as this kind of protector of the little one. And yet here they are trying to get students fired, literally from their jobs.
Well, so this gets back to the sort of the point in the beginning of like, what is the purpose of these unions, right? Is this trying to improve, economic conditions for its members and its workers and for labor and for the students, or is it something else? And I think what the case increasingly is with some unions is that, the goal in part is to gain as much money as they can, to promote, either various progressive causes, to pay officials and to pay themselves, to pay, for various events and activities and all sorts of things. So, like, one, it's worth noting that, like in the case of electrical workers and many other unions, the majority of the dues collected in agency fees collected by the local union, the student union at that particular school, the majority of those dues go to the national union
to fund activities that have nothing to do with actually what concerns, nothing to do with addressing the concern that got the students to unionize in the first place, right?
Well, I think they would argue, certain things that, the national union, is in, they likely have some representation in Washington, D.C. and, things like AFL-CIO, they're, very close to the White House. They're, trying to advocate for workers' rights and better conditions for workers in national and state capitals. So, there's, I guess, a bit of an advocacy thing that they would argue that's why it's necessary to send money to the national union, right? Now, that being said, I think what perhaps is, I think is certainly unfortunate is that these unions do not simply advocate for simple, better economic terms on the part of, workers. And so they're very much embedded in the larger progressive political milieu out there. And so, you can go on their website, for example, the website of many of these national unions, and you can see their stances on a whole host of issues. And so you can see, their support for all sorts of causes, from defunding the police to abortion, to you name it, to Israel and Palestine. The United Electrical Workers in particular was the first student to support BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, in Israel. So essentially, these unions, these national unions, are doing a lot of other political, largely progressive advocacy. And so from my standpoint, and from the standpoint of someone that's being coerced into joining such an organization, it's against my own values and religious faith to support those things, and I do not wish to monetarily contribute to such an organization. I don't feel like I should be forced to do so. And so one thing that students can do is they so fast forward to August, and the university at Stanford, for example, began telling students that if you do not pay dues or agency fees by a certain date, your employment will be terminated. So that's kind of the latest thing. And so now,
so basically, Stanford decided to side against the students, and
they decided. I mean, they tied their hands. I mean, again, in my opinion, the foolish thing that they did was they agreed to these terms in the collective bargaining agreement, right? So if they, if the union continues to prod them on this and the university doesn't actually follow through with what they agreed to in the collective bargaining agreement, there's repercussions for the university, legal repercussions for the university, right? So they go ahead. They basically say if you don't pay union dues or agency fees by a certain date, then you may be terminated from the university. And so
And the date for you was today.
The date for me was today. That's correct. What
are your recourses? Are there any recourses for students?
So one recourse, and that this applies to my case, is you can seek an accommodation as a religious objector. So if it is the case that some of the values or activism or things that the unions support, so for example, the Senior Graduate Workers Union came out with a statement about Palestine and Israel, and again, it was the first to support BDS. For many Jewish students, they feel like those sentiments are opposite to their Jewish faith, and they seek a religious accommodation under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And so, for example, if you're a Roman Catholic and you feel that the Senior Graduate Workers Union's positions on abortion, for example, contravene your religious faith, you can seek a Title VII Civil Rights Act accommodation, and those accommodations are processed by the union.
Yeah. What happens if you're, I know people like this who are pro-life, but not religious, not for religious reason. They're just pro-life. You and I know someone in common who is like this. So these people, would they have any recourse?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. What's challenging is, so the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, outlines these protected classes, race, sex, and religion among them, and so I think you have to argue that in order to qualify for a Title VII Civil Rights Act accommodation, you need to make a compelling argument that this would violate one of those. And so it's a good question, and I'm not sure what the precedent is on this exactly. And
no, I understand. I understand obviously the the imperative that protecting these classes. Of course, the best solution is the rights to work type of legislation where effectively you can't coerce. You can't coerce people to be forced to join a union or to pay dues. That's like the principal position. But I'm glad that at least some students are able to be protected and not have to fund things that are contrary to their religious beliefs. But so what is the situation with you right now? Like, where is the case standing for you?
So for me, it's currently again my Title VII Civil Rights Act religious objector test request is being processed by the union. So it's just the case that how at least the university sees it is that this is now is between me and the union, and it's up to the union to grant me such an accommodation. Now, I think if you look carefully at the law, you could argue that it's actually also up to the university to discern whether or not a religious accommodation is appropriate here as well. But at least from a practical standpoint, how it's working is my accommodation is being assessed by the national union, the National United Electrical Workers Union. There's a process that they have. I believe the sort of next step is to send me some sort of a survey to see, under what things I object against or something like that. But that's where it currently stands.
So, and you were very nice to share with me the draft of your Wall Street Journal piece. So there, I learned that some students at the University of Chicago are actually going to court over this, right? So it's like they incur a real cost in this case. These were Jewish students, right?
That's right.
That you talked about.
That's right, and they're being represented by Jones Day, I believe. I'm not quite sure if the law firm is doing this pro bono. There's many lawyers out there that take these sorts of cases pro bono. Perhaps the right to work legal.
Yeah, but the time, obviously the time, the anxiety that this causes is quite astonishing. Is often grad students. They're teaching, they're studying, they have to write dissertation and stuff. It has a lot of cost, it seems to me.
Of course. In particular, the students at University of Chicago and the plaintiffs there, the Graduate Students for Academic Freedom is the name of their group, and they filed a federal lawsuit. And they're making an argument that the union arrangement sort of violates their First Amendment rights under cases like Yanis. There was a famous Supreme Court case a few years ago, which held that sort of compelled agency fees, violate free speech rights of non-members by essentially, compelling them to subsidize private speech on these sorts of matters of public concern that we're talking about in all these issues, which unions tend to fall on very progressive lines on. And but the Yanis in general, there was a case regarding a public employee, so an employee of the government, who is being coerced by a public union. And so the case here is really trying to argue, I think, that the plaintiffs are trying to make an argument that these Yanis rights should apply to members of a non-public union, so outside of government, that this violates free speech rights, and those sort of Yanis rights of not being compelled to pay agency fees or join a union or pay union dues applies to them as well. So that's what's going on, and you can read about it online. Yes, I think that's currently being litigated. There's all sorts of litigation out there related to unions right now. I believe there's some case that Paul Clement is arguing related to this sort of impacts the ability to even sue unions. So you can't even necessarily hold unions liable for things, and it's kind of similar to how you can't really sue public schools in the United States. And depending on the outcome of that case, people, if Paul Clement's side wins that case, it will open the door for people to be able to sue unions going forward. So, in your Stanford review piece, you talk about some of the changes that Harvard has made about classifying grad workers, I guess. Yes. This gets back to the sort of original thing we discussed about whether or not non-employees count as being part of the so-called unit. So, where does the bargaining unit, where does that cover? And so, in sort of my understanding of this, like, for example, at Stanford, there's students that, there are people who are affected by this, who the union claimed to represent, who aren't even necessarily graduate students. And maybe they're like a research assistant somewhere in the university. Maybe they're a pre-doc somewhere. Maybe they're working in a lab in some way. And, the union, say, for example, wants to, obviously cover as many people as possible because, more people you cover, and then try and get to become union members or to pay agency fees, that means more money for the union, right? So now the university can do certain things with sort of classifying students and can classify students out of certain statuses that would fall into that, that bargaining unit. And that's what Harvard essentially did, is they moved 800 people out of that. So it's this is sort of the cutting edge of labor relations these right now. But I remember when I was at Harvard about 5 years ago, there was a strike at that time, and they were striking over a number of things. Largely, they were trying to fight for things of the sort of childcare nature and so forth. But again, it's a similar sort of issue where, to my knowledge, I'm not quite sure whether they've tried to coerce students to join or not. I'm not sure if they have. But I do know that, like, at places like MIT, Cornell, University of Chicago, and now Stanford, that there has been some of this activity.
My colleague Leah Palagishvili and another colleague, they did a review of unions and basically their efficacy, and it's really interesting. You've done some work with Leah on AI, right? But so Leah, but so they have a paper that's worth reading. It's basically a review of the literature on unions, and it's really interesting because along some margins they're actually kind of they're good, but they're bad along other margins, and like, so for instance, they're pretty good at getting people to keep their jobs, but as a result they're actually really not good at the firms. If I remember correctly, the firms that are unionized tend to perform much less after the unionization, and in part, right, it's because the unions are successful in getting people to basically keep their job, to log their jobs, and things like this. So that paper is worth reading. But good luck with all of this, because I assume it's going to continue. And thank you for actually kind of writing about it, because it's important for people to know. But that gives me the opportunity to actually pivot to some of the work that you've done at Mercatus. Is it with Leah, your AI work? Are you doing this with Leah?
So Leah's supported us in many ways. Certainly, her group and program supported us. So the co-author teams is myself, Philip Jalewski, Vitor Mello, and Brendan Moore. And so we've been supported by both Mercatus and by Emergent Ventures. And Tyler Cowan. And essentially what we're doing is we're running surveys every quarter. We're essentially spending $10,000 to ask people in a nationally representative survey, are you using large language models at work? And trying to figure out which occupations, which sectors of the economy are using generative AI tools at work. So trying to figure out what exactly does generative AI adoption look like, and trying to map that out over time. And then with that in hand, we're using that as sort of an exposure measure to determine, to what degree are occupations that are more exposed to generative AI tools or are using generative AI tools more, how are their wages changing in response to them, or how are the number of jobs in, say, that occupation or industry changing, and how's the number of job openings changing, and so forth. So
what did you find?
So for now, we're still working on the labor market effects side of it. We should have some results soon. Mm-hmm. What we have found is that there's been a massive uptick in just the use of generative AI tools. So, for example, in particular, in the first few quarters of 2025, and so the fraction of people using generative AI tools on a regular basis is basically shot up from around 30% using generative AI tools at work. The fraction of people using generative AI tools at work shot up from about 30% to about 45% just in the past few quarters. And so this lines up pretty well with anecdotal evidence from, for example, Sam Altman at OpenAI. He said that the number of ChatGPT users basically doubled in the span of a few weeks around late March, early April. And that's consistent with what we find. There's been a lot of increased use recently, especially in Gemini. which is Google's generative AI tool, and also Anthropic's kind of, I think, with Claude is becoming a leader in sort of the coding space as well. So there's a lot going on in terms of which tools people are using, and we're really excited to continue to be able to look at this.
Yeah, that's great. You know what I find interesting about now we're very early into the adoption of AI, but I kind of I think people would have predicted that they would have all merged towards kind of one model, and so far, I'm not very well versed in all this, but so far it's listening to how people are using it. It seemed that they're using different models for different things, and so there's actually an enormous differentiation between the models. Is that what you see?
I think so. So far, yeah. I mean, it's certainly early days, and you remember at the beginning of search engines. There were 8 or 9 search engines up there, from Hotbot to Ask Jeeves to Netscape Navigator, to Google, right?
Yeah.
And, there were all these search or Yahoo, you name it. There are all these different search engines, and that collapsed pretty quickly to only a few, or to essentially one key player, Google, right? Once they got their
and they were all kind of doing the same, and the few were all doing the same thing effectively, right?
That's right. But Google kind of got a bit better than all of them now.
Yeah.
Now this is very different, right? So this is, I'd say, a page index rank, which was the algorithm that Sergey Brin and Larry Page came up with, and that sort of sits behind the idea of Google searches. That's, I'd say, a very different object, I'd say, than, say, compared to large language models, which is, it just has so many more degrees of freedom in terms of what they can do, what they're trying to accomplish. Are they trying to help people with coding, or are they trying to help people with writing things? Are they trying to help people with quantitative analysis? All these things are very different, or can be. And so I think for now, I think there's good reason maybe to be specialization amongst these, but I think time will tell whether there's consolidation. We've seen a lot of moves just in the past few months from, say, Mark Zuckerberg trying to hire a lot of AI talent, paying a lot of money to try and get some of the best AI minds, acquiring companies. And it's possible that you could see more sorts of consolidation, or more sorts of things of this sort of nature to try and get ahead in so early days of generative AI.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, again, I follow this from a distance, but the news last week, there was this report, and then I think Sam Altman kind of confirmed it, right? That they're not seeing the productivity coming out of the enormous investments that many firms have done, and that kind of and Altman kind of has kind of confirmed this, and it seemed that it's kind of in a weird ways popping at least the bubble a little bit, right? I thought this is kind of interesting because it feels that we're so much at the beginning of what AI is going to deliver, that I thought maybe everyone is trying to kind of speeding up the bubbles are coming faster, they're popping faster. They're people are saying, are expecting maybe the productivity gains to be obviously visible immediately. I think Meta is actually shrinking the pool of people it's hired. So had this hiring spree, and now it's kind of scaling back down. So it's kind of it's weird. It looks like everything is just going faster and faster and faster. So it's going to be interesting. You're doing this thing. You're a leader, you guys, in actually trying to get this survey out. And so it's going to be fascinating what you find. And I wonder whether what you find in the next few months is actually a reflection also on but I guess there's a difference between the adoption, and whether it's really, you see it in the productivity numbers and things like this. So it's really interesting.
If they're substitutes, then we'd maybe see some jobs starting to disappear. I think the jury's still out. I mean, there's some work that's been done recently by Eric Brynjolfsson, which suggests that, particularly for younger people, that there's maybe a lot of substitution going on. But I think it's still very sort of speculative and very early to really be mapping out what the broader labor market effective generative AI tools are going to do.
The last thing I want to talk to you about, and it has nothing to do with any of this, except maybe that it's about economics. But I saw right before we got on air that you wrote with John Cochrane, and I can't remember who are the other two or three. You wrote a paper about John Taylor, and it was a recognizing, basically kind of giving a survey of the contribution of John Taylor to economics. Can you give us a little, first, why John Taylor? I mean, obviously he's at Hoover, but there are many amazing people at Stanford. But you guys picked John Taylor and give us kind of some bullet points for people who may not know his work, why you wrote this piece.
Absolutely. So John Taylor, in our opinion, is, I think it's difficult, can't really be denied, is that John Taylor is one of the most important macroeconomists of the past 50 years. And we essentially make this case for why that's true. So I think there's sort of two areas of John Taylor's academic contributions that are hugely fundamental. And then we talk a bit about John's public service. John Taylor worked in the undersecretary, he worked in the George W. Bush administration. He was the undersecretary for international affairs. He'd worked in prior administrations as well. He helped set up the central bank in Iraq after U.S. invasion of Iraq and after they deposed Saddam Hussein. And so he'd done a number of things in government, but he also, what's amazing too, even when he was an academic, he really spent a lot of time promoting his ideas at central banks. So he was always engaged in policy, always engaged with policymakers, wasn't just writing papers and ideas down and publishing them. He also started this monetary policy conference, the Economic Policy Working Group at Hoover as well. And so the Hoover Monetary Policy Conference has become a massive annual conference and a staple in the monetary policy circuit of conferences. And that's really thanks to John Taylor's contributions. And later, folks like John Cochrane, Michael Bordeaux, and Valerie Ramey now.
Yeah, Michael Bordeaux is another one who was writing, right, that piece.
So basically there was this conference that was held in celebration of John Taylor in his all his work, both his academic work and public service, in May. This was the day before the Hoover Monetary Policy Conference, annual conference that I just mentioned, that John Taylor's responsible really for starting about 15 years ago. And so the paper, so our paper kind of summarizes all the other papers that were being presented at this conference, celebrating and acknowledging John Taylor's contributions. And I say there's kind of, again, two major academic contributions. And one's pretty well known. That's the
Taylor rule.
Taylor rule, and this idea that you can both describe monetary policy and as a reaction function to changes in inflation and unemployment or an output gap, or how GDP is deviating from potential GDP. That is very well known. Most of John Taylor's citations come from both his major Taylor rule papers, both the Taylor 1993 rule and the Taylor 1999 rule, which has a slightly larger output gap. That it's also I'll get in a minute get into why it's not just important from an empirical perspective. From a theoretical perspective, it also in the three equation Keynesian model allows there to be equilibrium determinacy. So there's a couple of reasons why it was so successful, but it came in at the perfect time, just when central banks were adopting sort of a new Keynesian framework of inflation targets. And really focusing on focusing on interest rates as the monetary policy instrument. But now, John Taylor also did something else, which was also fundamental, that sort of preceded all of this and really laid the foundations for new Keynesian economic modeling. And so to give you sort of a very brief history of sort of history of macroeconomic thought, you had for many decades, starting in the 1930s, you had the rise of the old Keynesians. The old Keynesians, believed that it was all about government spending, big G. It was all about ameliorating recessions, and that was critical. And then that kind of fell apart when what happened was, and this is sort of based on this idea of a Phillips curve, a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And so this all broke down in the 1970s, and when you had both unemployment and inflation going up at the same time. And that kind of really opened the door for there to be sort of a rethinking of old Keynesianism. So what happened was there were both the monetarists, the MB equals PQ types, the Freemans of the world, that really highlighted that money was important. And in tandem, you also had another group of people who started what's called the rational expectations revolution. So these are people like Tom Sargent. These are people like Robert Lucas and people like Ed Prescott. And those folks really created these much more complicated models, much more complicated than just MV equals PQ, and sort of had three key equations. And I don't say both or a number of things, but the key the key of that rational expectations revolution was those sorts of models, real business cycle models, did not allow for there to be real effects of monetary policy. Monetary policy was sort of neutral in the short run. And so some people, including Milton Friedman, when he wrote Monetary History of the United States with Anna Schwartz, it came out in the 1960s, sort of laid the case that really the Federal Reserve was behind the Great Depression, that monetary policy was so tight that it made the Great Depression worse. So people believed that monetary policy wasn't neutral. So this kind of made the real business cycle people, the rational expectations people, the Lucas Prescott's and Sargent's of the world, their models weren't realistic because they didn't allow for monetary non-neutrality or for monetary policy to have effects on the real economy, things like GDP and so forth. So John Taylor comes along and says, well, if you have some sort of frictions in this sort of model, you could produce some real economic effects. These sorts of frictions could be sticky prices, they could be sticky wages, they could be sticky information. And so John Taylor, in a very famous couple of papers, 1979, 1980, sort of introduced this idea or helped usher in this idea of sticky prices. And he developed this thing called Taylor contracts, and because they have a fixed time horizon. And he was really the first one to really model this. Now, a few years later, there was another economist by the name of Guillermo Calvo who kind of, rather than having fixed contracts or fixed time periods where prices would adjust, he had sort of a fixed probability in when prices would adjust. And that sort of framework became a little bit easier to use in models and became much more popular in terms of building these sorts of three equation new Keynesian DSGE models. But that idea of frictions, of sticky prices, sticky wages, and so forth has been fundamental to macroeconomic models or models used at central banks since then. And have become extremely popular in the past 35 years. And now we can debate. I think there's actually a lot of healthy room for debate on what kind of frictions matter. I don't personally think that sticky prices really matter as much anymore in the economy because, for instance, we've got a massive amount of sales that are now online, right? And we have dynamic pricing on places like Amazon, Uber, Lyft, and so forth, where prices are changing more often than they are in offline retail stores. Now, in offline,
and this is going to matter more. Sorry for interrupting, but as the independent workers become a bigger share of the labor force.
But yeah, assuming they do, it's still, I think, pretty small. But I think even more so, you look at things like electronic shelf labels, for example. So if you go to the grocery store, especially in the past sort of couple of years, you'll notice that there's these little screens instead of sort of paper price tags. Now they're becoming increasingly commonplace. About by the end of next year, Walmart said they're going to have electronic shelf labels or ESLs in half their stores. And so if you go at China, for example, about half the sales in that economy are e-commerce related, according to some statistics. And so, as
that's a good point.
It's increasingly the case in my mind that sticky prices and menu costs are kind of going to zero. But that doesn't mean that that there might be other frictions in the economy, like sticky wages or things like sticky information that creates frictions for monetary policy to have real effects. I think it clearly does. I mean, I think the best evidence we have of this, I'm an empirical macroeconomist. I love these sorts of empirical examples. We had the Great Depression example that Milton Friedman and Aaron Schwartz gave in their classic monetary history of the United States. The Fed kept money too tight, and that contributed to the Great Depression. You also have the Volcker shock too, when Paul Volcker raised interest rates pretty enormously to like 20 some odd percent. There was a recession that followed that pretty quickly. Now he also crushed inflation, which was celebrated as a huge victory. But again, it just sort of is a great example of an exogenous monetary shock that's causing there to be some changes in real economic activity. There's another great example, historical example that I personally love that people don't really know a whole lot about. And this example in history. I sort of have a working paper on this. But the Confederate Currency Reform Act of 1864. And long story short, the Confederacy had their own currency. And the Confederacy, after the Union had taken New Orleans, the Confederacy was split into two. You had the East Confederacy and the West Confederacy because the entire Mississippi was controlled by Union forces. And this prevented money and paper notes from flowing from one side of the Confederacy to the other. So what was also going on in the Confederacy in the later part of the Civil War in the U.S. is that there was sort of runaway inflation because people had less faith in the Confederate currency as the sort of cotton economy was sort of collapsing in the Confederacy. So what they did is they passed this bill. It's called the Confederate Currency Act. They tried to fight inflation by reducing the money supply by a third, and the challenge was they couldn't really do this monetary policy in the western part of the Confederacy because the bills couldn't, the new currency couldn't flow to the western part of the Confederacy. So, anyways, if you look at both sides of the Confederacy, basically inflation was arrested or stopped in one side, but not the other. And you can also look at economic activity, how that differs across the other. So it's a great natural experiment. I love those sorts of natural experiments that really say something. These are three examples that kind of really give evidence that monetary policy has real economic effects. And so Jon Taylor, getting back to Jon Taylor, he sort of saw this, believed that monetary policy still had real effects. And he found a way very early to put that into models. And I think that's an incredible contribution. Also seeing how you could describe monetary policy, a simple way, that's the Taylor rule, beautiful way of doing that. He did that kind of before everyone else did, saw that, you could also use a Taylor rule to have equilibrium determinacy. And now a Taylor rule is one of the main three equations in Keynesian TSG models. These models aren't perfect. I'm often a critic of them at times. It's maybe the best models that we still have. I don't know. I think there's macro modeling is in an interesting place, but Jon Taylor has certainly made some of the biggest advances in macroeconomics, and that was the whole idea of the paper, and recognizing this was the whole goal of the conference.
And this, by the way, to people who are listening, is a great great evidence for why you should listen to Jon's podcast, which I mentioned at the beginning. And it's just like I'm always amazed when I listen to your podcast about how much you know about the history of thought, of macro, and how you can just explain it just so easily. I mean, each time you interview like a great economist, and you've interviewed many, you know their work, you know where they fit in the history of thought. You know how their models kind of conflict some, or the challenge they're trying to. It's always amazing. If you guys, it's not just for geeks, because it actually. It's a fascinating podcast. So that's all the time we have now, but thank you so much, Jon. This was great.
Thanks so much, Vera, for having me. And if anyone's interested in listening, it's Capitalism and Freedom in the 21st Century podcast. the Hoover Institution. It's a real honor to be able to have conversations with economists all the time, like yourself, Sarah. So I really appreciate you.
And it's everywhere. You find it literally everywhere, and it is really. I've told my children. I said, you need, like my girls are studying economics, and I said you need to listen to this. It's fun, and it's actually kind of fascinating. And the thing that I love so much about your podcast is the history of thought part of it, which I don't know if it's intentional, but effectively you always place the conversation you have in the broader context of the time. So it's really interesting. It's a great podcast. So thanks again.
Thanks so much, Farrah, for having me.